Christians like me believe that 2,000 years ago, Jesus was born in Bethlehem. It was one of the most important events in the history of the world. Wherever there are Christians, the event is recreated with Mary and Joseph in a rustic setting, with admiring shepherds and wise men greeting the newborn Christ in a manger. But this is the story of the Nativity that you won't have seen performed in the school hall. The traditional nativity scene depicts the arrival of Jesus into the world. The Bible story tells it as no ordinary birth. But some historians call almost every element into question, putting them on a collision course with the first cornerstone of Christianity. It was not only the start of a new life, but the birth of an entire new religion.
The birth of Christ, the death and the resurrection of Christ are the pillars on which the faith is built.
According to the Bible, the Nativity was the arrival of a baby unique in human history, who was God's own son, an event Christians believe happened without the help of a human father.
People are very uncomfortable with the idea of challenging these stories because they're religiously and culturally so important to us.
It was the birth of the baby whose adult life and radical beliefs would lead to his eventual crucifixion. I believe that this Christmas, especially as we face the gloom of global financial meltdown, there has never been a more important time to unwrap the Christmas story that many people have missed. So I'm setting off on a journey around the world to investigate the Nativity story. To find out why the Bible stories of the birth of Jesus are at odds with each other, to hear shocking theories about the virgin birth that have angered some Christians since they surfaced in the 2nd century, and to uncover layers of later tradition which have overlaid the events 2,000 years ago.
This story is like a mosaic overcovered with dust.
Was the story of the Nativity a deliberately coded theological creation by those who set out to construct the new Christian religion after Jesus' death? Could major parts of the story that changed the world simply have been made up? And if it was, how much would it change for Christians like me who believe the world needs to listen to the message of the adult Jesus? I can only find out by decoding the Nativity piece by piece. Most of the nativity scene comes wrapped up in a very deliberate coded message. In the middle is the baby Jesus in a manger. His parents, Mary and Joseph, have their baby in a stable because they can't find anywhere else to stay. Jesus is born in a manger with animals nearby, one of them a donkey, which has brought Mary here on a long journey. Tipped off by angels, shepherds come to see the new baby, and wise men from far-off lands arrive in Bethlehem, guided there by a star. The first thing to decode is where the whole story is set, and it's definitely no accident. The Nativity story, as told all over the world, is set in Bethlehem. My journey begins in this famous small town, 6 miles from Jerusalem. But even before the Bible was written, questions were being raised about whether Jesus was actually born here. This is the Church of the Nativity in Bethlehem. For Christians, it's the centerpiece of any pilgrimage to the Holy Land.
Since the 1st century, the place in which it is recorded and people have gone to as marking the place of birth is Bethlehem. I mean, it is, unchanging, constant since the time of the birth of Christ. For 2,000 years, people have said this is where Jesus was born. End of story.
first evidence for the site of this church being the precise location of Jesus' birth dates back to writings from the 3rd century, suggesting pilgrims were already visiting this site within 250 years of the actual nativity. There's a real solemnity and holiness about this place. You can literally smell and feel the centuries of prayers and incense that have been offered here. And those prayers are part of the very fabric of the place. If you clean it, you wipe away the faith. Every time I come here, I feel moved by the thought that this is a place of history that changed the world. That's what brings thousands of pilgrims to this site every year. Its power is that people believe it. It was the same in the 3rd century. Even then, the accounts make it clear that the authenticity of this site was already being challenged almost from the very start.
I don't think these sites are historically accurate. I suppose that the church validates their activity to the extent that there are churches on these sites, and so Christians going there assume that, you know, this is the place where it happened. But I mean, when you think about the historical background to this, nobody was taking any notes at the time.
The Church of the Nativity is one of numerous sites linked by tradition to the infant Jesus in Bethlehem. The models in the International Museum of the Nativity here underlie the widespread hold the story has across the world. There's even the Milk Grotto, a cavern where, according to legend, Mary is said to have spilled her breast milk on the limestone. It's one of many such grottos and tourist sites in Bethlehem, laying claim to supposed incidents of Jesus' infancy. Here, there's a superstition which leads women to eat the stone powder to increase their fertility. None of this is mentioned in the Bible. There are 2 Bible accounts of the Nativity, but they conflict with one another on some of the most familiar parts of the story. Except this being the town where Jesus was born.
If you did just sort of bullet points of the 2 accounts we have and put them side by side, the only parallels that I can see is Mary's pregnant, Joseph is not the father, and they go to Bethlehem, or they are in Bethlehem when the child is born. Everything else is different. Everything else.
But the reason historians are skeptical about Jesus being born in this town is contained in the pages of the Old Testament, which identified Bethlehem as the place where a significant birth would occur.
In Bethlehem in Judea, for thus it is written by the prophet, "And thou, Bethlehem, in the land of Judah, are not the least among the princes of Judah. For out of thee shall come a governor, that shall rule my people Israel."
It is profoundly true that the prophets predicted that the house of bread, Bethlehem, would be the place where the Messiah would be born, and they believed that the Messiah would be a descendant of David. And that is an absolutely vital part of the Nativity story.
Historians look at that, though, and they raise their eyebrows a bit, because there's a prophecy in the Hebrew Bible that the coming Messiah would be born in Bethlehem. And whenever there's a narrative that is fulfilling a prophecy, you have to ask the question, did it really happen that way, or did the writer, in order to fulfill the prophecy, say that Jesus was born in Bethlehem?
This is part of the Palace of King David. It's the only ancient site in Bethlehem which is directly linked to him.
Well, the point of Jesus being born in Bethlehem is that Bethlehem is where David came from, the king of the Jews, and it's where the new David, the new Messiah, is to be born in David's hometown, Bethlehem.
There's something not quite right here. this place is empty. It's almost as if it isn't an important historical site. Yet, it's very important for Christians to be able to connect Jesus with King David and Bethlehem. The prophecies in the Old Testament say that the Messiah must come from Bethlehem and be related to King David. The New Testament writers Matthew and Luke provide the only Bible accounts of Jesus' birth. The traditional Bible formula of a long genealogy is used to show the prophecy was being fulfilled, and that Jesus was descended from King David a total of 28 generations earlier.
The purpose in both Matthew and Luke of the genealogy was to prove that Jesus was the descendant of King David, and as such could claim the title of King Messiah.
It does come up later in the Gospel of John. There's no birth narrative in John, but toward the end of Jesus' life, people begin saying, well, wait a minute, you're not from Bethlehem, so how could you be the Messiah? Because the prophecy says you'll be born in Bethlehem. What that shows you, at least, is people are debating this, even after the life of Jesus, as they're writing the Gospels. Some people are saying, oh, he was born in Bethlehem, and others are saying, well, he's not born in Bethlehem. So apparently it's something that even within the Gospels they are having problems with, trying to figure out.
But 2,000 years later, this question seems to have been forgotten. And whilst the pilgrims flocked to Bethlehem's other sites, I'm the only one here. So the fact that there's nobody here suggests it's not important. But it is important. It's the one site in Bethlehem that helps us decode the location of Jesus' birth. Jesus was known as Jesus of Nazareth. Since the time of the earliest Christians, many have thought that that town, 70 miles away from Bethlehem, was a more likely birthplace for Jesus.
If you took a poll of historians of this period, I think the majority would say the Bethlehem story is mythology, meaning it's made up to fulfill prophecy, and that Jesus is from Nazareth and is probably just born in Nazareth.
Traditionally, Bethlehem is the birthplace of Jesus, but many historians question that and suggest that Nazareth is the place where he was more likely to have been born. How do you feel about that?
Well, I don't possess the Holy Family's diary, and I don't really see how one would come to a conclusion.
The location of Jesus' birth is the first piece of the Nativity puzzle to put church and historian at odds with one another.
I think we ought to pay more attention, first of all, to the weight of tradition. And then, secondly, from a Catholic point of view, to what we would call the inerrancy of Scripture.
In the next part, my journey continues as we decode the Bible accounts of the birth of Jesus and ask why they give such conflicting versions of some of the most familiar elements of the Nativity story. Was the birth really in a stable? And what does it actually mean to be born in a manger? Does it change the nature of the birth of Jesus if it didn't happen in the way that most of us have been taught? The story of the Nativity is a cornerstone of Christianity. 2,000 years on, it's still reenacted and embedded in our culture. But the nativity scene we know of Jesus' birth is loaded with code. Every piece carries a hidden meaning. At the center of the scene is the baby Jesus, laid in a manger. It tells us that Jesus' origins were humble. But where does our image of the manger come from? Is it the Bible or not? And have we actually got it wrong about what a manger really is? Like most people, I've always pictured a manger as a wooden feeding trough turned into a makeshift cradle for the baby Jesus. The next part of my journey takes me to a site in Nebi Samuel, between Nazareth and Bethlehem, where a team of archaeologists have uncovered remains of a manger in a first-century house dating back to the time of Jesus' birth.
This really represents a typical first-century house, a house that would have existed roughly at the time of Jesus.
But the manger the archaeologists have found here might paint a more realistic picture of the way many Jewish children in this part of the world may have been born in Jesus' time.
And then over here, you would have a hallway which extended into the main part of the house where the manger was located, so animals could be moved inside.
Inside, the excavations show that a manger isn't a wooden trough. It's built into the floor, cut into the rock, and the archaeologists think it would have been a welcoming place to give birth.
You'd go through a large entrance and you'd enter into a space very similar to this. As you can see, there are these side chambers. The roof is supported by these columns, and in each of these columns you have these tie holes, so that the animals would have been tied up. So you'd have Joseph and Mary taken in by a household, and the birth took place in the best room, the warmest room in the house.
How normal is this? Would this have happened to your average family, or is this what happens to people of a lowly state? What facilities would there have been? What would she have felt like? Would it have been comfortable for her giving birth here?
The people in the house probably know who he is, and he's given the comforts of the house. The manger is not, sort of something that you're sort of begrudgingly, you open the doors to somebody, but it actually is the best place in the house.
You have the story that Jesus was put in a manger because there was nowhere else for them in the inn. That could mean in the Greek they just didn't have somewhere to put a baby. It doesn't necessarily mean he was in a stable. But we then have the stable. Once you've got the stable, you've got the ox, you've got the ass. Once you've got that, you have shepherds kneeling down in the straw. You have your whole school nativity scene. When you actually go back to the text of the gospel, you find to your astonishment it doesn't actually say that he was born in a stable at all.
And there's something else that this real manger reveals about our image of the Nativity. If Jesus was born in a manger like this, it seems a more accurate picture would have more women in it and fewer men.
When you take into consideration that there are certain sort of emissions and certain sort of bodily fluids which are associated with the birth, and these are the things that Jews were very, very fearful of. All of the men would have been banished out of the manger, and the birth that would then have taken place.
So in the traditional nativity scene, there are people missing, and they're women. There should be a couple of midwives in there, and people who have assisted with the purification.
Yes. You wouldn't get a situation like you get when you watch a sort of a Hollywood film where the husband rushes in and kisses the wife and then cuddles the baby. That would not have been the case. There would have been a distance which had been maintained until all of the purification rites had been fulfilled. The picture of Mary with the baby surrounded by all these men, wise men or shepherds or whatever, this sort of scene is incorrect.
So in Jewish Palestinian homes at the time, like those in Bethlehem and the surrounding area, being born in a manger could suggest a more normal birth in a hospitable home, a home which might well have existed. The Bible account suggests the birth took place in Bethlehem because it was the ancestral home of Joseph's family. If it was, wouldn't he have had someone he could call on with his pregnant wife?
The fact that it took place within a house indicates, in my mind, that here you have the Middle Eastern process of hospitality, which was important for any of these facilities.
In one account we have a house, in another we have a manger. How do you account for the different descriptions of where Jesus is born, the actual location?
These texts are not designed to answer our kind of 21st century historical questions. There is no mention of the stable anywhere in the Bible. All we're told in Luke's account is that they go to Bethlehem and it's packed out and there's no room for them at an inn, and therefore she produces her son and puts him in a feeding trough. And that's the only... Now, out of that one mention of feeding trough or manger comes all the idea of stables and backyards of pubs or whatever. But from the point of view, Luke's much more interested in who Jesus is and his significance than where he was born.
In Matthew's Gospel, there's mention of a house, but no manger at all.
It depends who you believe. Matthew says he was born in a house, Luke says he was born in a manger. I think probably he was simply born at home in Nazareth, in his own home.
Nazareth is 70 miles from Bethlehem. The Bible tells us a universal census demanded that Mary and Joseph make this trip. And of course, the manger, and in turn the stable, were only needed because before Jesus was born, a long journey had to be made. Or did it? 2,000 years on, it's a detail behind a key element in the story, still reenacted and embedded into our culture today.
In those days, Caesar Augustus issued a decree that a census should be taken of the entire Roman world. This was the first census that took place while Quirinius was governor of Syria.
Luke has them go down to Bethlehem because of a Roman census at the time. And he actually gives the date of the census under a ruler that Augustus had put in. His name is Quirinius.
This Quirinius couldn't have done this during the reign of Herod because he was not governor of Syria at that time. He was governor of Syria in AD 6.
The only census we know of is in 6 AD. There is a census, but it's 10 years too late. Jesus will be 10 years old, so it can't be his birth.
I think what Luke is doing is he's using something that's known from the ancient world. People knew there was a census around about that time. So he's sort of linking the history of Jesus to that event. But he's doing it in a slightly sort of awkward way, because what he's really doing with the census is providing a way as to why this family from Nazareth have to go down to Bethlehem. And so, of course, it's whilst they're there that Jesus is born.
So it's a device?
I think so. It's a literary device, yes.
The census story in Luke's Gospel suggests Joseph had to make the trip to Bethlehem that ended up with the birth in the manger because that was his ancestral hometown, the town that connected him to King David 28 generations earlier.
The difficulty with Luke's presentation, though, is that there would never have been any requirement for somebody from Galilee to travel all the way down to Judea, to Bethlehem, to be registered for this census. I mean, it doesn't make any sense. Why would people go to some sort of ancestral home? How would you know your ancestral home anyway? And it would just be, the whole thing would be a logistical nightmare. And that's not the way Romans did it.
My journey so far has raised questions about the historical accuracy of the original Bible accounts of the Nativity. There's scepticism about our traditions that Jesus was born in a stable. Questions about what it meant to be born in a manger. And real doubts about whether the familiar journey with Mary on the donkey ever happened at all. Neither of the Bible writers who tell the story of Jesus' birth knew him as an adult, let alone a child. And their accounts were written long after the event.
They were probably written about 80 or 90 years after the birth of Jesus, so really a long time has passed. Whether they had any kind of first-hand testimony is very much open to doubt.
So if they didn't have first-hand testimony, are Matthew and Luke reliable reporters?
Probably when it comes to the birth of Jesus, I would say no.
But the nativity story we know from the pages of the Bible was designed not just to tell us what actually happened when Mary gave birth, but to help define the nature of the Christianity its writers wanted to spread across the world. But the Bible story itself has been overlaid by 2,000 years of tradition, making the Nativity even harder to decode.
The traditional Christmas story that people carry in their heads it's this assembly of things that they picked up from songs, from Christmas plays, just from stories told, from the television, from books. And it does have a kind of a sweet, tender mythology to it. But a historian comes at it quite differently with the sources and the texts that we have, and tries to put it in its rather brutal setting, actually, of Roman occupation, this child born whose life is in danger, a woman who's pregnant outside of marriage. If you begin to add that edge to the story and put it more in its realistic setting, different things begin to emerge, problems as well as just narratives.
Wherever Jesus was actually born, the real beginning of the nativity story comes before that. It's the moment that he was conceived and how. To discover what clues history has to that event, I'm travelling into Galilee to find out more about Mary and about Joseph. Jesus' conception is the act which defined Christianity, an act, we're told, that did not involve a human father. So where did that leave Joseph? He is part of the Holy Family in every nativity scene, but his role is one of the big mysteries in the story of Jesus' birth. The puzzle of Joseph's role begins in the Bible. Joseph features in Jesus' birth line because the ancestral line back to King David comes to Jesus through him.
There's something a bit surprising about the genealogies in that they seem to be tracing the genealogy of Joseph, who, according to the story, shouldn't be the father of Jesus. So to a certain extent, you could say that they were either irrelevant or rather undermine the story of the virgin birth.
The genealogy in Matthew is very nice and uniform. It is always A begot B, Jacob was the father of Joseph, and then the next thing would be, and Joseph begot Jesus. Well, you don't get quite that. Suddenly, the uniformity stops, and the writer was slightly confused and embarrassed, and instead of following the normal way, changes in the Greek text to say that Mary, the Virgin, was the wife of Joseph, of whom was born Jesus, who is known as the Christ.
Mary turns up pregnant and Joseph isn't the father. The most fundamentalist believer would nod their head and say, yeah, God is the father. And the historian comes in and says, well, actually, we agree on one point, not who is the father, but that Joseph is not the father.
In the next part, I decode the central event of the Nativity, the moment which gave birth not only to the baby Jesus, but to an entire new religion. An event inextricably linked to the nature of Christianity itself, the virgin birth. What would it mean for Christians like me if a story that circulated for nearly 2,000 years were true? Could it be that Jesus had a human father after all? My journey to decode the Nativity is challenging some of my long-held assumptions about the birth which changed the world. It seems some of the Nativity story we're taught is embellished beyond what it says in the Bible, and appears at odds with historical detective work. At the heart of the nativity scene, two figures are more important than any others, Jesus and his mother Mary. To Christians, the birth was a miracle. That's because the Bible tells us that the Holy Spirit was responsible for her pregnancy, not Joseph or any other man. But this event, which changed the course of history, is the one which contains the most powerful code of all. This is the Church of the Annunciation in Nazareth, which claims the exact spot where Mary found out she was pregnant. The virgin birth has been a defining cornerstone of Christian doctrine since the earliest days of the Church.
Jesus was not conceived in the way of a human person because uniquely he is God and man. And the work of his conception, if you can put it like that, was through this power of the Holy Spirit. The Holy Spirit shall overshadow you. And that's the essential core truth.
In my childhood, I took the virgin birth for granted. It's almost hardwired into me to accept it as a miracle. But now, I've come to Galilee to hear some very different accounts of the circumstances of Jesus' conception. Controversial accounts that have been in circulation for almost as long as the Bible story. Some of them sourced from a large town near Nazareth.
People have this view of Nazareth as this little hilltop village isolated up somewhere in Galilee, and Jesus grows up there. But as he looks to the north, out his window, so to speak, there's this huge megapolis of a city, the largest metropolitan area in all of Galilee, called Sepphoris.
This is Sepphoris, on the opposite side of the hill from Nazareth. Archaeologists here have made some revealing discoveries directly related to my quest. This is the street where Mary and Joseph would have done their shopping. It may also be where Joseph found work as a carpenter. This is the point in the Nativity story where Christian belief and skeptical modern historians are on their most obvious collision course.
Historians know that everybody's born and everybody dies. I mean, that's the one thing you can say about everybody. But they're more interested in what goes on between the birth and the death. And theology seems to just collapse that and say, well, how did he get here? How did he leave? Let's talk about that.
The next step on this journey to decode the Nativity leads me to unwrap a story clothed in claim and counterclaim, possibly since the 1st century. Like many claims about Jesus' life, the evidence is circumstantial because there are so few facts historians can be sure of.
It is reasonably certain that a Jewish boy by the name of Jesus, whose parents were called Joseph and Mary, was born in the land of Israel, and certainly not 2008 years ago. Because Jesus, according to all indications, was born while King Herod the Great was still alive. Now, Herod died in 4 BC.
That's all that we know.
Well, I think this is all we can be sure.
The timing of Jesus' birth around 4 BC has led some historians to see a link to another event that happened the same year. In 4 BC, in Sepphoris, across the valley from Nazareth, the townsfolk paid the price for a big mistake. They rebelled against the Romans. The response was ruthless. The Roman governor of nearby Syria razed the entire district to the ground, killing anyone who got in their way, selling many of the inhabitants into slavery, and raping boys and girls. The discoveries at this ancient site, recorded since the time of the 1st century historian Josephus, set the scene for a shocking alternative version of Jesus' conception. Why is this site important for understanding what life was like in the first century under Roman occupation? What kind of trauma took place here?
The city of Sepphoris was ruined completely in the year 4 BCE during the crash of a major revolt that took place immediately after the death of Herod. This is probably the time when Jesus was born. So this is the background of Sepphoris in the time of Jesus. This was a major catastrophe and trauma exactly during the time when Jesus was born.
The historian Israel Knoll has thought long and hard about what in his opinion would possibly make a Jewish man here at the time of Jesus' birth act as Joseph did, stay loyal to a woman who was pregnant by someone else, something that was out of keeping with local traditions at the time.
If it is a love affair, if you have, two people who are witnesses, and they were warned, the full legal procedure, she would put to death with the man she had a love affair with him. Both of them should be put to death. She would be stoned.
So she'd be stoned?
Stoned.
If it was a love affair?
Yes.
To me, at the heart of the story is what we would call some sort of irregularity, some sort of embarrassment, some sort of scandal. I think that's the one thing we can say for sure. And I think it's very important for understanding Jesus. Joseph was not his father. And that raises the question, then, who was?
Talking to Israel Knoll has revealed a story which first emerged as early as the 1st century. For many Christians, it will be a deeply unsettling theory. He links the traumatic events that happened here in Sepphoris directly to the circumstances in which Mary could have conceived Jesus by a human father.
Well, if I take the kernel of the story as historical, I think the only possibility that is remaining for us is a possibility of a rape. And as I told you before, we are speaking about the time of major trauma in this area. And we know from Josephus that many women were raped by Roman soldiers during this period. So this, I think, would be the logical result if it is historical that she was engaged to him and she became pregnant by somebody else and still he kept her with him. Only possibility is a rape.
That's quite a shocking statement to make, and many Christians would be horrified by the idea that Mary was actually raped. Is there any other evidence to back up this rape story?
Well, the evidence is very much connected to the exact point where we are sitting. We're sitting on the side of the main road of Sepphoris.
Professor Knoll refers to a remark overheard by a famous Jewish rabbi on this very street within 100 years of Jesus' death. It was recounted by a 2nd century writer and passed on through history. The overheard comment suggested an actual name for a possible human father of Jesus.
We've got 3 sources, basically, that call Jesus the son of Pantera. One is a Roman philosopher named Celsus. He's from the 2nd century, and he says, I've gotten this on good evidence, that the real story of Jesus' birth is that he's the son of a Roman soldier named Pantera. So he just reports that he has heard this. We've also got in some early rabbinic sources, Jewish sources, from Sepphoris, which is up by Nazareth. They're simply talking about one day a man who followed Jesus, son of Pantera, said this or said that. Or my teacher, Jesus, son of Pantera, said this. So they're very neutral references, just in a passing way, calling him the son of this person, Pantera.
Pantera was actually a very common name amongst Roman soldiers of the day, so it strikes us as a strange name, but it would. It's quite normal to people in those circumstances. People have sometimes suggested that it's actually a play on the word Parthenos, meaning virgin. I'm not very sure about that. I think the two are actually quite dissimilar. I think it's more likely that this is simply an attempt to disparage Jesus by disparaging his mother and disparaging his birth.
Some have suggested that the calling Jesus son of Pantera is a way of scandalizing things and saying that essentially this Savior you follow is a bastard and a son of a Roman soldier, a way of making fun of him. I don't go along with that because the earliest references we have in Jewish sources are not using it in a polemical way. They're using it in a descriptive way. And they're actually identifying Jesus, as opposed to other Jesuses, by this name.
Some historians call this the Pantera myth. Some think Pantera could have been Jesus' father, but not a rapist or Roman soldier. Others argue the violence in Sepphoris was triggered by the death of Herod the Great, and after Jesus' birth. But from the 1st or 2nd centuries, such ideas of rape or illegitimacy carried with them a possible malicious meaning, in stark contrast to the virgin birth. Above Sepphoris, another settlement was systematically obliterated. Marian Sawicki is an anthropologist who has worked on archaeological sites in Galilee. Like me, she's a Christian, but her work here put her face to face with the circumstantial evidence that Mary might have been raped.
So this is really quite a catastrophic background to the Nativity. You've got Mary, this young girl, who's in a town which has been brutalized by the Romans physically in terms of the buildings, emotionally and physically in terms of the flesh, brutalizing people, raping young girls. That's the backdrop to this girl conceiving. It's quite brutal.
Backdrop is a nice euphemism. Yes, people will ask me, did it happen to Mary or not?
So what do you think happened to Mary?
Well, either she was raped or she wasn't. Those are the logical possibilities. If she was raped, I say, I wonder how she told her father. So totally using our imagination and what we know of the community at that time. The father has a choice to make, and the father in Mary's case likely would have said, you are still my dear daughter, you are still who you were, you are still welcome at this house, and there will still be a man for you.
I'm suddenly quite confused. This bleak, traumatized landscape still evokes the terrible events which happened here 2,000 years ago. Was this the site, not of a miracle, but of a personal tragedy? And does this account mean we should rethink Joseph's role into something less puzzling and much more positive?
It was his choice, and the fact that he made his choice to accept her back, to take the children, is in my view an evidence that there was true love between these two young people, that he had a sensitivity to the trauma that she had gone through, and he decided to accept her and to accept the child. This is something very, very significant and impressive.
Is it more miraculous for the finger of God somehow to reach in and tweak some chromosomes so that somehow one of Mary's ova turns into a full-term baby? Is that more miraculous, or is it more miraculous to think of the heart and soul of Joseph going through what he had to go through, the heart and soul of Mary's father, Mary herself? Why is that not a miracle? I mean, what kind of miracles do you want?
It's all speculation about a theory, but it's very moving.
I was really blown away by what Marianne said, because it tells me that the Nativity doesn't have to be about a miraculous, supernatural impregnation of a woman by God, but instead the miracle can be the way in which people deal with tragedy and brutality in their lives, the way in which they make life out of death, out of hope, out of tragedy. That is the miracle of the Nativity.
But I'm only too aware
that the way Marianne, as a Christian anthropologist, has reconciled the contested rape story in her mind will provoke very different responses amongst other Christians.
I think it is an anthropologist's view, and it is, of course, it's appealing, but it's not the Christian story, and I would not want it to disguise or in any way distract from the core Christian story. Of course, the Christmas story is evocative of sympathy, and it's evocative of wonder at its beauty. But underneath that, it is an invitation to take a huge step of faith. Not just faith in the goodness of humanity, which that interpretation certainly emphasizes, but a faith in the initiative that God has taken. And that is the truly remarkable thing that Christians celebrate at this feast.
How do you feel about those who argue that there was a human father involved? There are several ideas. The story of Pantera, the potential rape story. Are these issues that perplex the church?
Well, I regard such people and such speculation with genial understanding and sympathy. They are speculating about matters which cannot possibly be concluded. I realize that these speculations are very considerable obstacles to entering into the level and realm of discourse and connection which really does yield the meaning of this event, the meaning of the story. This is part of our mental furniture as modern people. This is part of a generation that is symbolically challenged. This is the tragedy. These are unprofitable speculations, but they're not something which should provoke anybody to anger or dismissing them. This is part of the difficulty of being a person at this particular point in history.
As I leave Sepphoris and the alternative birth story behind me, I need to reconnect with the image of Mary I like the most. As a Christian, one of my favourite passages in the Bible seems to tell us that the birth of Jesus brings about a major social revolution. These are the words that the Gospel writer Luke gives to Mary when discussing her unexpected pregnancy. It's surprisingly revolutionary in tone.
He has scattered those who are proud. He has brought down rulers from their thrones. He has filled the hungry, but has sent the rich away empty.
Regardless of the nature of Jesus' conception, could the bleak politics governing the birth and childhood of Jesus have created the catalyst in which the radicalism of Jesus was instilled? I really like what's happening in this part of the Nativity. A piece of Old Testament radicalism is breaking into the story. In this case, it's the great reversal tradition where the high, the powerful and the mighty are brought down, and the lowly and the poor are uplifted, and the hungry, they are fed. It's like the writer wants us to know that the birth story isn't meant to be soft, comfortable, easy, but instead is tied to a revolutionary order breaking into the world where the rich are brought down and the poor are exalted. However you choose to picture the virgin birth, the Nativity made Mary the world's most famous mother. Her iconic status in Christianity is echoed when 6 centuries after Jesus' birth, she became one of the most significant figures in the Quran. But the Quran's account of the conception differs once again from that of the Bible.
The story of the Annunciation, which is the bit of the Quranic story that differs most obviously from the sort of familiar biblical story, because there's no manger, there's no shepherds, there's no stable, there's nothing of that. Instead, she goes out on her own into the desert, and the angel appears to her, and she's terrified, and she's told that she will have a child. She doesn't understand because she's young. She goes out on her own into the desert, and the angel appears to her, and she's terrified, and she's told that she will have a child. She doesn't understand because she's young, she's a virgin, no man has touched her, as she said. The angel said, "This is God's decree." She accepts the decree, and then, in due course, she delivers the child far out in the desert, underneath a palm tree, alone. And one of the most touching images in the whole of the Quran is this image of the young, innocent, traduced girl.
In fact, there are more mentions of the Virgin Mary in the Quran than any other woman. But the Muslim holy book interprets the nativity story quite differently from the gospel writers.
It's not so much about Jesus, it's more about the Virgin Mary. There's a shift of emphasis there. And the reason for that, presumably, is that the Quran is interested not in a vision of history as having one great moment where heaven and earth are reconciled, which in the Christian vision is the crucifixion, but rather has an idea of the love and generosity of God being expressed through a very large number, an indefinite number, of fully saving interventions in history. And she represents one of those, even though she's a woman. And all of the prophets whose stories that the Quran celebrates, Moses and Jacob and Ishmael and the prophets of old, are all delivering a form of salvation that's just as good as anything Jesus will offer.
The Quran's account of the Nativity differ from that of the Bible. In the Quran, Jesus is acknowledged as a prophet from God rather than his son. But it's the Virgin Mary who is emphasized. She appears as the perfected woman who can receive miracles from a God capable of anything, including giving her a baby without a human father.
The principle of Mary's virginity is there in Christianity, there in Islam, but the meaning is very different.
The virgin birth became a pillar of Christianity, confirming Jesus' divine nature. It's the single most important component of the whole nativity story. But not everyone who calls themselves Christian believes literally in the virgin birth. Some point to issues of translation in the Bible text, and a host of alternative readings suggesting that the word virgin simply means young woman or a girl not yet of childbearing age. But on this point of doctrine, the Catholic Church is, and always has been, unambiguous. Do I as a Christian have to believe in that literal birth of Jesus through a virgin to be Christian?
Well, I think to be a Christian, you certainly have to believe in the divinity of Christ. You have to say, this, at least the invitation of faith is this, that this is not just a good man, this is not simply an exceptional teacher, this is not a man who acquired insight and wisdom by a process of reflection and prayer and ascetics. But right to the heart of the Christian faith is that in Jesus is both the divine and human nature. And it's that and that only that opens up the key of what we call salvation. The Church has always said that reality of Jesus is there from his beginnings, his first moments of his conception. And therefore that conception, as is witnessed to by Scripture, is the work of the Holy Spirit and not the work of normal sexual intercourse between a man and a woman.
So the answer is no, I can't be fully Christian then.
I think people will struggle with that.
In the next part of my journey, the Nativity takes on a fresh dimension as I decode some of the most misunderstood characters in the Nativity scene, the shepherds and the wise men. How should we decode the bit players of the Nativity? Every one of them is there for a reason. And it isn't what meets the eye. To decode the Nativity, I need to separate out layers of meaning in the story that changed the world. Alongside the central figures in the stable are the shepherds and the wise men. They too are layered in meaning. But the meaning we give them today have distorted their real role in the story. They're here to tell us who were the very first audience for the Nativity.
they appear to be adding little more than rustic charm in our traditional image of the nativity scene. But there is more to the shepherds in the story than meets the eye. Whenever I see shepherds in my travels through the Holy Land, I think of the shepherds in the Nativity, imagining the angels tipping them off about Jesus' birth. By drafting in the shepherds, the original Bible writers were using strong imagery that connected with their audience, the language those storytellers of the time knew could convey the big news they wanted to spread.
Although people in the ancient world were interested in history and what happened, I think they were also much more open to picture language that expresses different truths that aren't necessarily things that you can actually quantify and prove.
This picture language tells us about the character of the religion that was being written into the Bible. The shepherds appear only in Luke's account of the Nativity, and they help make his message clear.
Well, shepherds could symbolize all sorts of different things. I mean, in the Old Testament, they're often used as rulers, and King David, of course, was famously a shepherd king. But I think the way that Luke is using them is as representatives of lowly people, people on the margins.
In the ancient world, shepherds carried a symbolic meaning, dating back to Romulus, the founder of Rome. There was a tradition in the ancient world of shepherds being present at any time that a new civilization or a new reality is being given birth. So they signify something new, something different, and nurturers of that new tradition. And a good example of that is found within this Roman coin I picked up. It's 2,000 years old, and it depicts a shepherd. It's an important image because a shepherd is present at the birth of Rome. There's a shepherd who nurtures Romulus and Remus. Historians are sometimes seen as killjoys with the shepherd story because they point out that according to age-old tradition, around Bethlehem at the time, shepherds only kept their flocks out in the fields from March to November, making the 25th of December an unlikely birth date for Jesus. With or without the angels in the fields, on the night of Jesus' birth, the land where he was born was very different. It was a land in turmoil, facing the growing power of the Roman Empire, a power that the adult Jesus would know only too well. The shepherds in these fields today are Muslims, a religion that would not be founded for a further 600 years after the Nativity. But the night that Jesus was born, the shepherds here were Jewish, like Jesus himself.
He's also a Jew, born of a woman, with the family around, and there's a real political and social context to what he did.
Jesus was born Jewish. As he grew up, he remained a Jew, observing Jewish traditions and festivals until the end of his life. In the early years after his death, the control of Jesus' radical movement remained in the hands of his closest Jewish followers.
They didn't see themselves as Christians, but as Galilean Jews who had no interest in setting up a new religion, but reforming the old one. And they saw Jesus, their brother, as a Tzaddik, a righteous Jew, a teacher with a new code of ethics that could help people live a good life. The later Christian belief that Jesus was the Son of God, born of a virgin, who was sacrificed, then resurrected to save the world from sin, would have been completely alien to them.
During the life of Jesus, the picture language in Rome still dedicated the empire to its pantheon of ancient gods. Within 300 years, that would change. New pictures would be painted in Rome. Instead of the pantheon of gods, the imperial power made way for the disciples of Jesus. With the Nativity story, An unmissable act of God had broken all the rules of what had gone before. God had come to earth, humbled himself in a tough human life, and died a tortured death. The story had power, even in imperial Rome. The apostles responsible now sat at Jesus' side. The new picture language set Paul, the architect of Christianity as we know it, next to Luke, the man many believe was his key follower, to whom is ascribed the picture language of the shepherds in the Nativity. These three other outsiders in the Nativity scene are another piece of picture language. They are some of the favourite characters in the Nativity story, perhaps because they bring presents. But their real role is to be the flip side of the shepherds. They're here to tell us that the Nativity story, like the rest of the Christian message, was also being targeted at a non-Jewish audience across the empire and beyond.
One of the wise men has always caught my eye. In every nativity set I've ever seen, one of the wise men is always black.
As I grew up, I felt curious about seeing a black man at the heart of the Nativity, with the white-looking Holy Family.
But who was this wise man? Was he a king? And if so, where was he from?
The Bible says that the wise men came from the east, but there's good reason why I'm heading west, from the Holy Land in search of the black wise man. Even though I know from the start that tracking him down is not going to be easy.
In Matthew's Gospel you have people coming from the east, wise men. They've seen a star and they give him three presents, gold, frankincense, myrrh. It doesn't say in the story there are three of them. It just says a group give him three presents. That turns into three people, three wise men. Then you get, just towards the end of the 2nd century, you get this African sage or theologian, Tertullian, saying they were kings.
At the time of Jesus' birth, an African king sat on the throne of Aksum in modern-day Ethiopia. There are two reasons why I think this is the place I might find out how the black man made it into the Nativity. And the first clue is a gift.
I've discovered that frankincense and myrrh come from trees, and that these trees can only be found in one part of Africa. Somewhere out there.
An historical detective could see that there was good logic to one of the Magi being from this part of Africa. The ancient trading routes for the wise men's gifts of gold, frankincense and myrrh could be followed here from Jerusalem to the roof of Africa, the mountain range that covers parts of Sudan, Eritrea and much of Ethiopia.
They make this long journey over to Bethlehem and they give Jesus the gifts, of course. And I suppose that suggests that they're men of some wealth. They can make the journey. They have money to buy gold, frankincense and myrrh.
Frankincense was in demand in Jerusalem. It was as valuable as jewels, producing white smoke when burnt in almost every ceremony in the temple there. This was the gift that Balthazar is seen giving to Jesus. It's sweet smelling and comes from the gum of the boswellia tree. As in Balthazar's day, they're still collecting frankincense and it still brings them good money.
Smells sweet.
Yeah, it's sweet and it is brings dollar. We export it.
Yeah,
the best ones. World market.
But there is another, much bigger clue to decoding the story of the black wise man, and it doesn't come from the Bible.
You know, the wise men, I guess, are the best known story next to the shepherds. And the evidence we have is the verses in Matthew, and that's it. We have absolutely nothing else.
In the Bible, Matthew doesn't help my quest. He says nothing about which countries the wise men came from, gives no names, and even confers no kingly status. For the first time, 500 years after the Nativity, a Greek manuscript gave the wise men names. Then they got countries of origin. Finally, by the 10th century, a pious Christian writer known as Pseudo Bede went one further
giving the kings ages and specific ethnic traits. A section of the Old Testament provided a theological link to enable their makeover as kings. Everything else was retrofitted.
This is all the interpretation of Old Testament texts which have nothing to do with the actual story of the birth of Jesus.
But it didn't stop the church-funded painters of the Renaissance. Pseudo Bede had handed them a simple artist's brief, fitting to the time of the Crusades.
So gradually, as the centuries go on, they become kings and they have names: Balthazar, Caspar, Melchior, and even they become representative of different parts of the world. So you have an older man, you have a younger man, you have a black man too. So what it's saying is that in time, these are the people who are going to make up the Christian community.
It took 1,000 years after the birth of Jesus for one of the three wise men to evolve into Balthazar, the king of Ethiopia.
As a story, it's grown and grown throughout the ages. So the arrival of the kings, as we call them now, even though it says in the New Testament that they were wise men, is a legitimate development. It's not just a question, you can't just dream up what you choose. There's discipline here. There's discipline that identifies, the community identifies legitimate developments that really do deepen the meaning, deepen the understanding.
But how legitimate was the Black Wise Man? When Jesus was born, what's now Ethiopia had a very different place in the world from today. Aksum was the seat of a grand civilization, which gave up its pagan god and built on the Jewish influences of the Old Testament, which paved the way to Christianity. Between Rome and Persia, there was no grander empire. But where was Balthazar? The king who actually turned Ethiopia Christian was King Azana in the 4th century. His coins testify to it, as he swapped the pagan symbol of the disc and the crescent for the cross. But I'm already doubtful about Balthazar. How could he have been the king travelling to see Jesus and then leave it to someone else 300 years later to bring Christianity to his own kingdom? At much the same time, parts of North Africa and the Roman Empire were converting too. What is more, the list of kings in this part of Africa do not include a Balthazar.
And we've got to take them, I think, as a flowering of the richness of the Christian story, of the Christmas story, and not spoil it by an overdose of skeptical historicity.
The closest to Balthazar I can find is King Bassan, who ruled the ancient Ethiopian kingdom of Aksum when Jesus was born. But I'm afraid, on this part of the Nativity, I think I'm deep into legend. This monumental grave is said to be that of King Bassan, but I'm getting skeptical now. There's no evidence anywhere around here of any Christian symbolism. Local tradition now superimposes the real king here at the time of Jesus' birth and the later 9th century Christian creation, the so-called King Balthazar of Ethiopia, depicted for 1,000 years as the Black Wise Man.
So according to your tradition, it's King Bassan who introduces Christianity into Ethiopia. So he becomes a big figure here then?
Yeah, is a big figure, especially in Ethiopian Orthodox Church, and then the people who lived around Aksum.
Was he one of the Magi?
Yeah, he was one of the Magi, and he was just among the 3 Magi, the black one, which offered a gold gift to Jesus. That's why just Ethiopia became the 2nd country in the world next to the Israel, just to know about the birth of Jesus and to adopt Christianity. So this is a revelation of God.
I don't think King Bassan brought Christianity here. I think Balthazar was imaginary, possibly
possibly inspired by yet more Old Testament prophecies that African kings would offer gifts to the Messiah. In reality, the first Christian king was here 300 years after Jesus' death, not present at his birth. But it's not the end of my journey. I've just discovered that there are pictures of the nativity scene nearby, and I'm intrigued to see what they show.
Here's the picture of the Holy Family, and you can see quite clearly King Bassan depicted delivering his gift of gold. What's unique about this is that Salome is also included in the picture, the midwife. But what I'm struggling with is the fact that given that Bassan is from here, Ethiopia, and is an African, you would have thought they'd made some effort to distinguish his Africanness from the Easternness or Jewishness of the other figures.
Having set off deep into ancient Ethiopia to find the Black Wise Man, when I finally arrive, it seems to be the one place in the world where there's no Black Wise Man at all.
Now this says a great deal. It's actually quite shocking. You've got Mary and Jesus, the Holy Child, using the same kind of colour symbolism that we find in the rest of the church, where the Holy Family are painted in a light shade. And then in contrast, we have a picture of the devil, and the devil is black. You know, this is some serious stuff happening here.
I think there never was a Black Wise Man. Probably King Bassan never was a Christian, even though he was on the throne at the time that Jesus was born. 900 years later, the church elsewhere seemed to have created itself a black African king to tell a new story to a new audience. As a result, a King Balthazar, unknown in Ethiopian history, was depicted as the Black Wise Man in the nativity scene and still appears on our Christmas cards today.
The Magi aren't in the fundamental area of Christian faith. To paraphrase an earlier question, if a Catholic chooses not to believe in the literal picture of the Magi on the Christmas card, that doesn't put their faith in jeopardy in any way at all.
I like seeing the image of a black man alongside Jesus, but decoding his story has left me more eager than ever to remove the layers of tradition that get in the way of understanding the main event of the Nativity. In the next part of my journey, I need to go back to a time before the Nativity became so overlaid with code. What did the Nativity look like to the earliest Christians before the later traditions ran away with the story? And after Jesus was born, why was there such a break in the Bible stories of his life? The Nativity story told all over the world has spread from the earliest accounts of the Bible. But belief has become blurred as layer upon layer of tradition has obscured the original meaning of the event. Beneath it all was a single birth which altered the course of history.
This is the baby that changed the world.
But my journey to decode it has found a confusing mix of later tradition overlaying what really happened. I now need to go back to the oldest sources of this momentous event. This is Mount Sinai in Egypt. Since the 3rd century, there's been a monastery here guarding some of the earliest clues about the Nativity. St. Catherine's is built under the mountain, where in the Old Testament Moses received the 10 Commandments from God. Here are pages from the oldest Bible in the world and some of the earliest images of the event which changed the course of human history. I'm hoping that here, at last, I'll be able to decode the Nativity story that we recreate every Christmas and understand what it means for me today. This is one of the world's 8 earliest images of the Nativity, safeguarded at St. Catherine's on Mount Sinai.
The art expert and nun, Sister Wendy Beckett, tracked it down, and she thinks it unlocks a series of clues about the way the earliest Christians saw Jesus' birth without any of the trappings of our nativity scene.
You might say this is the minimal nativity. This is the nativity in essence. This is really what it is. The full story doesn't add to that. It just extends it. It shows how the early church looked at mother and child. So it's precious not just for itself, but for what it tells us of that springtime of Christianity, that freshness and sense of wonder that perhaps we have lost or partly lost. One of the striking things here is that that face does show the man as well as the child. So we have the whole story of Jesus there. It's the most anxious face I know of the images of Christ.
I really like the way in which you describe the figure of Jesus and the anguish or anxiety that he has on his face, suggesting that the life offered by Jesus is therefore not going to be a life of ease. It's a struggle, it's a journey.
But he's not thinking of himself.
Yeah.
He's thinking of what he's giving, that way we may not accept it. Mm. I think that's the anxiety. Mm. So it's showing us that Jesus, fully human, was fully divine. It's not an ordinary baby, as one can too often see the images. This is what the Nativity is. This is Christmas. Jesus comes to us.
Also here at St. Catherine's are pages from the oldest Bible in the world, where the Gospel writers Matthew and Luke first told this story. It intrigues me that there are crossings out in the text. That's revealing, given how we hang our traditions on every word. This is an absolutely beautiful Bible, one of the most beautiful that I've seen. The detail in it is absolutely stunning. Among these exquisite ancient images, so beautifully preserved, I realised there's something odd. The Nativity is quite simple in that the Son of God comes into the world unnoticed. But there are lots of things happening in these stories that suggest it is a big event, it's important. There are wise men who turned up, that Magi turn up on the scene. There are shepherds who some people see as a little bit unclean, unkept, they burst on the scene, So even though it's an event which is meant to go unnoticed, the writers want us to notice that something major is happening, don't they?
They certainly do. And it remains a mystery as to why it remains so unnoticed. You have angels appearing in the heavens, you have wise men coming from Persia, you have the shepherds rushing to reverence him. These things would have become known and would have been talked about, and then it's as if Christ is forgotten until you see him briefly when he appears in the temple, and then you have Christ preaching in the wilderness.
The Bible tells us of the unforgettable events around Jesus' birth, and then, until he's an adult, he seems to vanish from its pages, apart from the briefest mentions as an adolescent. There's also something else that doesn't add up to the modern inquiring mind. Why don't any of the Bible accounts of Jesus' later life refer back to his extraordinary birth?
The Gospels were written first, and the Nativity story was prefixed to the existing document. This can be deduced from the fact that whereas the Nativity stories know what is in the Gospels, the Gospel story, which starts with John the Baptist and the public appearance of Jesus and finish with the crucifixion, never referred to what is specific to the nativity stories, like the star or the wise men or the shepherds in Bethlehem. In other words, the star or the wise men or the shepherds in Bethlehem. In other words, it was a complete gospel first, and then somebody decided, well, we need a preface to this, which will prepare in advance the story of the Son of God who came to redeem the Jews and the world.
It's pretty hard to ignore when one of the world's most respected Jesus scholars is convinced that the nativity stories were tacked on, almost as an afterthought. He's got a point if you think about it. It's unimaginable that Jesus could arrive with such a bang into the world and then escape notice for so much of his life, and for people not to recall him a couple of decades later when he made his mark on the world as an adult. St. Catherine's is an apt monument to the Nativity. Sitting beneath the mountain where Moses received the Ten Commandments, the monastery only exists because the Old Testament stories and prophecies became fused with the birth of Jesus to enable the ultimate establishment of the Christian Church.
There are many historians who, when they look at the story of the Nativity, challenge its reliability. They think that it's actually made up after the death and resurrection of Jesus. It's just a little preamble to add a bit of spice to the rest of the story. How do you respond to that argument?
It's clear that the Gospels are not written to answer our 21st century criteria of history and so on. And the bulk of the story, quite rightly, is the adult life of Jesus, his ministry and his death and his resurrection and so on. And these stories give us a way into that. That's clear. But they're not to be judged by 21st century ideas of history.
And here I come back to the central question of my journey to decode the Nativity. What is history and what is legend? A big penny has just dropped for me. It seems that scholars, and even some senior Christians, do think major parts of this most important of stories are embellished, serving a desire to create a new religion. It's quite a shocking realization. I've had ups and downs in my faith journey and come to recognize that it is right to question. You can't have a proper faith, a deep faith, without asking serious questions about what's happening within the biblical text. Now, there are some amazing and mysterious elements to this story. The stars, the angels, the dreams. So we've got to understand, what are Matthew and Luke really trying to tell us?
They are not, repeat, not historians. And if you start looking at them simply as historians, you'll eventually end up chucking them away and not really seeing what their books are about. If you're trying to say they are Simon Sharma or they are Andrew Roberts or some modern historian who've got all their facts wrong, then obviously there'd be no point in reading them. They haven't got the facts wrong. It's we who are mistaking the purpose of these books, if that's the way that we want to read them. What they're telling us about is their faith. They are much closer in time than we are to the historical Jesus, but they don't know any more about him than we do.
It feels like I've got to the bottom of the Nativity story. It's not really history, it's a special birth wrapped up in metaphor. Has this profoundly significant location brought me to the end of my quest? I was just wondering, what would the story of Jesus look and sound like and mean if there was no birth story? There is an example of this. It's found in the Gospel of Mark. Mark doesn't begin the life of Jesus with a manger and with angels and animals, but instead with a prophetic announcement that a revolutionary act is about to take place, that the Messiah is going to come.
John the Baptist appears on the scene, and then he baptizes Jesus. Jesus goes into the wilderness and comes out fighting. He calls his disciples together, and next he confronts the evil. He heals somebody. When I look at this image and consider its meaning, it propels me to action.
For me, the adult Jesus is the only way to unlock the baby Jesus. The nativity traditions that I've been decoding are beginning to be cleared away. The simpler image of the nativity that I've found here is the way to unlock the events behind the Christmas story and find the relevance to us today. There is one more part of the nativity story that I now think will complete my journey, and it's somewhere else in Egypt. The Bible accounts didn't end when Jesus was born and the wise men and the shepherds came. In the final act of the story, the nativity's biggest villain enters, but he's a character totally absent from the family-friendly version of the nativity story that we normally see. In the next part, the harsh reality of the life Jesus was born into, the seldom seen part of the story which turns Jesus and his family into refugees, and which brings us face to face with the real power that the nativity story holds today. Layers of tradition have overlaid the nativity story. The earliest Christians would probably find it hard to believe what has been added and why. So now it's time to look at the final part of the nativity story, the part that's often forgotten. Once Jesus has been born and the wise men have arrived, the next thing that happens changes the mood. It's the lesser told part of the nativity, one that introduces the villain into the story and turns Jesus from being the newborn king into a refugee. And it's this framing of the nativity that I want to explore as my journey to decode the nativity reaches its final stage. This is the view that King Herod the Great had from his palace in Jerusalem. When he enters the nativity, it stops being a simple story for children. This is the part rarely performed at school. The nativity crosses a watershed and becomes adult viewing.
The Christmas story is just so appealing with its music and its sweetness and all that it's come to stand for. And it's actually dealing with blood and sex and death, and it's pretty gritty, and it's set in a very brutal time.
After the birth of Jesus, there's a dramatic twist. Things become more brutal, callous, and sinister as we're introduced to the villain of the piece, Herod the Great, and we come to realize what kind of man he really was. In the Bible account, Herod's brutality was targeted at the baby Jesus. Having been outwitted by the wise men who ignored his request to tell him where Jesus was, Herod ordered the slaughter of all infants up to the age of 2, a scattergun attempt to kill off this new king sent from heaven. Was Herod the Great as evil and as brutal as tradition has it?
Yes, and probably more.
This is the lasting legacy of the villain of the nativity story. King Herod the Great was a historical figure who historians think was in power when Jesus was born.
I think Herod the Great was a very complex figure. In terms of foreign policy, he was brilliant. But at the same time, he was an iron ruler. He ruled the people with absolute fear, and he was a tyrant in many ways too.
After the charming story with the shepherds and the wise men, the Bible tells us that Jesus and his family were suddenly on the run, heading for Egypt to escape from Herod's killing spree.
He was also quite often completely mad and vicious, which went so far as to execute his much loved wife, his family, including 3 of his own sons. So he could have quite easily get rid of 20 little kids in Bethlehem. Would quite often completely mad and vicious, which went so far as to execute his much loved wife, his family, including 3 of his own sons. So he could have quite easily get rid of 20 little kids in Bethlehem. Wouldn't have noticed it.
It must have been absolutely terrifying to be on the run from Herod, and especially because you've done nothing wrong except have a young child. And worse still, your life's in danger from your own people, somebody who's supposed to be your political representative. But what it does tell me is that you can't tell the story of the Nativity without dealing with terror.
I think every story needs a villain. It needs a pantomime demon king. And Herod is that figure here. Herod also symbolizes boneheaded, stupid establishment authority. He's what anybody would see looking at this set of events who didn't have the eyes of faith.
But there's something else at work. Matthew is using the story of Egypt to enhance Jesus' credentials as the Messiah. Like so much of the Nativity story, the flight to Egypt was an echo of earlier tales told long before by the Old Testament. This terrifying storyline was fulfilling another prophecy.
You know, Matthew's the one, not Luke, but Matthew, he constantly refers to these prophecies being fulfilled. One of them is the flight to Egypt. It's a quote from Hosea, "Out of Egypt I've called my son." And the slaughter of Herod, he says, now that's this prophecy in Jeremiah. And they flee to Egypt, that's the prophecy.
In Cairo, the story has Mary and Joseph and the baby Jesus hiding from Herod's hitmen. With the flight to Egypt, terror displaces the Nativity's rustic charm.
That's one of the things about it which is so convincing, because if you started to make up a religion, if you wanted a religion of success, I could think of all sorts of ways of making up a religion of success, or a religion of peace and tranquility and stop history, let me get off. But actually, the one thing people are not expecting is for the author and creator of life himself to be embodied in a child in those circumstances. And stop history, let me get off. But actually, the one thing people are not expecting is for the author and creator of life himself to be embodied in a child in those circumstances.
For me, this lesser-known final act of the Nativity unlocks the meaning of the whole story. It bridges the infant Jesus into an adult world. 2,000 years on, in one of Cairo's more chaotic suburbs, that adult world is only too evident in the work being done by the Church of St. George in Heliopolis. Inside the church, I've stumbled across a modern echo of Mary, Joseph and the baby Jesus on the run. It's late at night, but those who run the church here are providing a roof for refugees who have just escaped the war in Darfur in Sudan. Right in front of me is the most contemporary resonance of the Nativity I've yet found. The connection with the flight to Egypt is clear to see for everyone here. I'm really interested in the work that you're doing with refugees, because the people here are fleeing from war, from tragedy, fear of death. And that's also true in the story of the flight to Egypt.
Yes, the same problem for Jesus or for refugees, because we are in the world as a stranger, all of us, as Jesus said. Yes.
That's a really powerful image for me.
Yes, yes.
You've had an absolutely terrible time as a refugee, fleeing your homeland and even having a difficult time here. Has that made your faith stronger, or do you now question God?
I won't question God, because I believe that the Israelites in Egypt were facing a terrible life. I believe in the Bible that says Moses tried to get them out of Egypt so that they could find their land back. I believe one day I will be free.
Seeing the church looking after the refugees is very moving. It's taken me a journey across the world and through 2,000 years of elaborate code to find this modern heart of the Nativity in Egypt. For me, following the example of the adult Jesus seems a much more fitting way to celebrate his birthday than recreating an overcomplicated baby picture. But more than ever, I can't help reflecting on the way the portrayal of the Holy Family as refugees is excluded from our traditional depictions of the Nativity. Perhaps it's an image at odds with the comforts of modern-day Christmas.
It grieves me that this great wonder, this miraculous proof of love, God's love, should be so overlaid by the tinsel and the glitter and the Christmas tree and the presents and the feasting. Those things are important, but they're not of the essence. This is the essence. This is what Christmas is. A divine child and his mother. Nothing else.
This depiction of the Nativity came before almost every other. There's not much in common between this very early depiction of the baby Jesus and this modern one. But I can't help thinking the Church has played its part in creating this coded imagery around the Nativity story most of us learn today. So in effect, we could say there's a central truth within the Nativity and a lot of window dressing to help make the story come alive.
I wouldn't call it window dressing. I think I would call it flowering, and which is quite different, because I think a flower, as it were, carries in it the energy and the life of the central message, whereas a window dressing is just a bit of paper stuck on the window.
But the overlooked ending of the Nativity story that's lasted for 2,000 years demonstrates that a story people believe in has a power of its own. Perhaps more powerful than the simple historical facts of Jesus' birth could ever be on their own.
I think the quest for the historical Jesus is a wild goose chase, quite honestly. I think the only Jesus is the Jesus of faith. And these stories, which obviously reflect the historical Jesus, are so much deeper and so much more important than just history.
History is one thing, meaning is another. There's a traditional Egyptian Christian story about the return of the Holy Family back from Egypt to Galilee. It's probably not convincing history, but it depicts Mary and Joseph escaping with the baby Jesus down the Nile on a felucca, an ancient sailboat. Thanks to my journey here, it doesn't matter so much to me now whether it literally happened that way or not. I've come to realize that the Nativity is a portrait of human life, but specifically struggling with stuff and overcoming. A young girl is found pregnant and is in trouble. She finds refuge in Joseph and with her family. People are trying to do Jesus in, trying to kill him. Herod's trying to kill him. And they find refuge here in Egypt. It's about struggle, but then overcoming that struggle. To have faith is to act within this world. It's not about sitting in a pew or in a mosque or synagogue and just thinking that that's it. Too much of this story, I feel, has been used to actually make people passive, make people feel that it's soft, gentle, easygoing, nice cuddly sheep and nice, strong, masculine shepherds, and it makes it too easy. It gets away from the messiness of it and the sense that even within this mess, there is a call for humans to act, to transform and improve the world. In conclusion, on the journey I've been on, my hunch is that there is a truth within the Nativity, but that truth has been flowered, to use your metaphor, It's a truth that has been developed over time and has taken on a life of its own. And therefore, when we talk about the Nativity and historical truth, we're really on shaky ground, because it is fundamentally a faith document, a faith story. How do you feel about my conclusion?
It's not bad. I mean, I would want to push you a bit, as you would expect, because I, sit here and speak for the Catholic faith. And I would want to push you a bit and say, try and just ease that apparent opposition out a bit. And try and, on the one hand, see the importance to faith, to Christian faith, of it simply not being a set of ideas, but being rooted in the soil of history. And if we tear out those roots, the faith will die.
But I'm a Christian that doesn't believe the faith will die if we question the Nativity. A religion that can't stand up to the inquiring mind of the modern world is more likely to die than live on. My personal faith doesn't depend on the miraculous events of the Nativity. I believe Jesus was most concerned with showing us what God can do, not creating a new religion. Once the Nativity is decoded, it doesn't have to be the event which distinguishes Christians from other religions. Instead, it can be the way that the message of the one God of the Old Testament spread far beyond the Holy Land for the first time. I believe in a God for all people at all times. Whether you believe the baby Jesus was 100% human or 100% divine or both. I believe we are all children of God, and that gives us all the power to make our lives count.
It also gives us the power to follow the radical example of the adult Jesus, to want to put right the injustices of this world, whether we are kings, shepherds, parents, or babies born in the most uncompromising of circumstances. Have a happy Christmas.
You can find out more about the issues raised in the programme on Channel 4's Faith and Belief website at channel4.com/belief. Next on 4, is it really better to give than receive? The Secret Millionaires revisit the people they helped.